Hi there. Welcome to a new podcast of the Walk for Wildlife that this year takes place as a virtual edition. My name is Reineke, and together with Monica, Esther, and Ruben, who are with me in this virtual meeting room, I speak on behalf of the Future for Nature Academy, an organization for young conservation students and professionals that aim to inspire the young generation for hands-on conservation work. And one of our activities last year was the Walk for Wildlife, for which we walked a trail of 2 days through the Dutch Nature Network, challenging ourselves to do so through the eyes of animals. Representing different animals, we walked across the landscape, questioning how the landscape is perceived from various animal perspectives. On our way, we interviewed multiple experts on nature conservation in the Netherlands and on how our nature management is shaped by our human view on the environment. How different would the landscape look like if we would design it from an animal or even a plant perspective? Some of these questions we discussed with Matthijs Schouten, natural philosopher, Buddhistic teacher, biologist, and much more. And now, approximately 1 year later, we seem to live in a totally different world shaped by Corona. For our virtual edition of the Walk for Wildlife this year, that you can follow on our social media channels, we re-invited Matthijs Schouten to make another Walk for Wildlife podcast episode that reflects on the COVID world we live in now and how Corona influences the way we see and interact with nature and how that might impact nature management. So, welcome back, Matthijs.
Hello.
How are you doing? Can you tell something about how the Corona measures impacted your own interaction with nature?
With nature, what I'm in a risk group. So from the lockdown onwards, which is now 5 months, I think, I have been more or less isolated in my own apartment in the middle of the city. So the only nature I've seen in those 5 months is the nature in on my balcony, and I also have a garden downstairs. So basically, my view of nature has become rather restricted, but at the same time, very much more intensified, because I realize that normally I take my garden and the plants on my balcony for granted, and I regularly water them or whatever you do. But in these 5 months, I became extremely intimate with every plant. I mean, I knew exactly when the first bud was sort of coming in on a plant, and then I was counting the days until the flower would open, etc., etc. So a restricted contact with nature, but much more intensified, I must say.
Well, that's a very interesting note. And maybe that also comes back in what our followers on social media actually answered to the questions we asked them. So
okay,
I would like to give the word to Monica now, and she will explain what our followers kind of answered to the same question that we asked to you. So Monica, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Reineke. Yes, as Reineke already explained, last week we asked our followers to tell us a bit more about their relationship with nature in times of COVID. And in particularly, we asked them whether COVID impacted the time they spent outside in nature, natural areas. This could be city parks, forests, gardens. And interestingly, we had quite some votes, both on Instagram and Facebook, with a total of 47 people answering, and 70% around 70% of these 47 people answered that they actually spend more time outside now after COVID or during COVID. We were wondering, what do you think of this relationship? Because I can understand it may be quite contrasting to your experience right now.
Yeah, contrasting in the sense that I, of course, can, because I live in the middle of the city, and for me it's quite difficult, since I also do not have a car, to get into nature. So my nature experience has become limited. But what I've heard from many people, because I'm constantly in contact with all kinds of groups and students and whatever through digital media, I've heard from many people that they in these last months have been more in contact with nature than before. Because a lot of people now, of course, cannot go to their work and have to work at home. And then they take walks, which they normally don't do that easily when they're in the office. And I've heard from many of the people that I've been in contact with that the time spent outdoors and in nature was larger than before. And what I also heard from many people is that also gave them new experiences, also a recollection of what they'd experienced in the past. There were many people who said it was like being a child again, discovering the outdoors. Because first of all, very often it wasn't, for these people, that was also the interesting aspect of it, not so busy out there, because when in the Corona times you went out, very often you were on your own in the middle of a forest. And for a lot of people, that was a sort of rediscovering contacts that they'd had when they were younger. At least that's what I got from the people I was in touch with.
Yes, so you think people are sort of getting some nostalgia back from experiencing nature.
Yeah, not just nostalgia, but also a pleasant rediscovery, I would say. I think what happened in the Corona crisis is, of course, that the normal rat race that everyone is in ceased to a certain extent, and so your daily circumstances changed, and therefore also you had to reestablish a relationship with your environment, and that gave, as I just told you, for some people quite surprising experiences. Because when you're always running and busy and on the way and traveling and etc., and suddenly that falls away a little bit, and you start to rediscover your environment, whether it's a city park or nature near where you live. Without that rat race, you re-establish a sort of connection that very often in our busy lives is lost. And I even used that. I was working with a group of about 45 young professionals. I was teaching them a masterclass before Corona started, and then we went into lockdown. So what we then did is we had weekly meetings for an hour online just to discuss what was happening to them and their work and their businesses, etc., and how to deal with Corona. And so at a certain moment, we decided that this could be a way of reconnecting with our environment and also with nature. And so one of the exercises I gave to the group is take 5 minutes a day and then just watch something that has in your environment that is not man-made. It can be a tree or a bird or a plant or a piece of earth or whatever. Just watch it for 5 minutes without any rational thought, without giving it a name, without labeling, without whatever. Just watch. And so they went home with that exercise, and a week later I spoke to the people again, and one of them said, yeah, I thought this was a rather silly exercise, but nevertheless I did it. And so I looked at a tree which is opposite my house, and I've seen that tree all my life. So, but now for 5 minutes a day, I just watched the tree without even calling it a tree. And I said, and what happened after a few days, that I cannot leave the house anymore without saying hello to the tree. And what happened there is that something you took for granted, but started to look at closer, and without all your preconceived ideas, became a subject with which you are in contact and in relationship. So I think that has happened, that coming into contact with the natural life around us has happened, I think, for quite a lot of people. Because you all have heard that the Dutch Organization for Bird Protection has gotten quite a lot of new members in the last months, because people suddenly become aware of the birds in their back gardens and hear them and see them. So I think in a way Corona can have helped us to reestablish a closer connection with life around us. But I don't know whether that comes from your survey.
Probably not. But it's interesting to see, yes, that this change in pace kind of gave us more time to actually think about nature, because I suppose it's something few of us would have the time to do, or the availability. Yeah, and interestingly, another question that we had, and this one wasn't so with such polarizing results, was if the pandemic contributed to change people's perception of nature. Here we had 57% yes and 43% no. So I wonder if if you would expect that a situation like this would lead people to rethink the way they perceive nature, and two, if people would realize it if they had rethought it.
Can I ask you, do you know if 50-something said that their perception of nature changed in your survey? Is that correct?
Yes, I also we also in brackets put that perception of nature would be the way they feel about how important it is to them. I know this is a bit difficult to define for people to answer, so there may be a bit of a undefined there, but
okay. So you don't know exactly how their perception changed?
No.
Okay, but also can I ask you, these are followers that you interviewed?
Yes.
So that is a slight bias, because all your followers already will have a certain,
of course,
quite strong contact with nature. Huh? So I can imagine that for your followers, the connection with nature is already very strong. So I think that for a lot of people who, unlike your followers, who haven't thought about nature at all in the past, or very little about nature, and took it for granted, or just ignored it in their busy lives, there the changes might be stronger, if you get what I'm trying to say, because for them it was never a topic or an issue that they were involved with, unlike the people you interviewed. And I can imagine that for those people things have changed. At least I hope that things have changed. And I find from them, because I'm constantly online with all kinds of groups, that for quite some people that really has happened, that there is a stronger awareness of the fact that there is life all around us. I mean, when you live in a city, and I live in the middle of Utrecht, when you live in a city during lockdown, the city becomes much quieter. You don't hear the cars anymore. Huh? The air becomes cleaner. That you can really experience that. But what also happens is that natural sounds like birds, or the wind rustling in the trees, they become clearer and clearer. So your perception of your normal surrounding changes a little bit during lockdown. And I think a lot of people will have experienced that to some extent. And don't forget, I mean, what I find an amazing image, and that's maybe not as dramatic as the things that we have experienced in the Netherlands, an amazing image is that young people in New Delhi, for the first time in their lives, saw the Himalayas. That was not possible until then. The people that are 20, 30 years old have never seen the Himalayas, because there was always smog. And then during lockdown, there in the far distance were these majestic mountains that play an important role in Indian civilization and culture, and also in the national identity, and you could see them. That's something they'll never forget.
And then the question is, of course, if this change perception, will stay.
Last.
Yeah. And we will probably, we have to see. But that is an interesting thought. And I think we can go on to two questions that two members of the Future for Nature Academy prepared. So I will give the word to Ruben.
Yes.
And he has a question about, actually the origin of COVID crisis. So Ruben, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Reineke. Yeah, I'd like to. I mean, I've been wondering about this for quite a while, and I'd like. So we discussed the consequences of the COVID pandemic and the lockdown, but the origins of this pandemic have often been linked to wildlife market, consumption of wild meat, even to deforestation. So basically, the environmental consequences of our consumption patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think of this relationship, and what does it say about our, as humans, our views of nature and our practices that are related to it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things with viruses like this COVID virus is, of course, animals carry viruses that can jump to humans. That has always happened. I mean, that in the history there have been many of these transmission of animal viruses to humans. That has happened as long as there have been humans and animals. But what happened in the past is that usually was on a small scale. That happened somewhere in a community living in I would say the rainforest, or somewhere in an area close to wild animals, and these humans wouldn't travel. So these outbreaks usually remained quite restricted. What has happened through the way we have dealt with nature is that we've put nature under enormous stress. The area for wildlife on this planet has reduced very, very considerably during the last centuries. That means that wildlife and wild populations of wild animals, are forced closer and closer onto each other, which can enhance the chances of viruses jumping from one animal population to another animal population, other type of animal. So that chance enhanced through the fact that we reduce the area of wildlife, force different species populations closer together where in the past would have no contact. Moreover, through the reason that we make the habitat for wildlife smaller and smaller, we put wild animals also under stressful circumstances, and stressful circumstances lead to disease. And when animals become diseased, they produce more viruses, etc., etc. Moreover, we encroach into nature more and more. We build roads, we build settlements in the middle of rainforests, etc., etc. And on the other hand, we bring wild animals from the wild to our markets. Now, in this way, we enhance the chance of transmission of virus from animal to human. And moreover, then we travel all over the world. There's a high mobility on the planet. So the chances of pandemics have grown basically through the fact that we have put nature under stress and reduced the area for wildlife. So if we want to prevent pandemics in the future, we should deal with our wild ecosystems more sensibly, I would say.
Yeah, so if I understand it correctly, it's quite a problematic relation with nature, and we see nature as something we can just use for our own benefits. We can penetrate rainforests if we want to, and so yeah, basically our relationship with nature and the way we look at nature has influenced this pandemic as well.
Definitely. You see, ultimately, you could say it all boils down to the fact that we feel that we can colonize nature without any restriction. That the earth is there for us, and we can colonize. I mean, the old Western idea of colonizing the world, that idea also has extended to nature. We colonize nature everywhere. Look at what is happening in Brazil. We feel no restrictions in the way we take on the space or colonize the space on this planet, and therefore also ecosystems. And I think if we want to prevent pandemics in the future, we have to have some sort of restraint. And of course, there will always be transmissions of diseases from animals to humans. but through leaving nature more space so that healthy populations of animals can thrive there, restraining our way in which we constantly colonize and invade natural systems, we make the chances of transmission less.
And how do you envision these restraints? Yeah, as long as people can freely move, I can imagine that they want to and they do it. But do you have an idea how that works? How people could change and be more respectful to nature?
Yeah, and that's the last thing you said, respectful to nature. That's what all boils down to. I think we should rethink our basic attitude to nature. We should rethink basically the question: who the hell do we think we are? Are we the rulers of this planet? Are we the owners of this planet? Do other species have a right to be there? Can we occupy everything? And that's, I think, the essential question that we as a species, a self-conscious species with a reflective mind, that is the most essential question that should be addressed now. When we really want to move to a sustainable future, there's loads of things that we can do in terms of technical developments and whatever, international agreements, but the basic issue is that each and everyone has to ask yourself the question: who do I think I am? And who do I want to be? And do I have respect, not only for other human life, but for life on this planet? And I feel that this question is not sufficiently addressed in the societal discourse on the human-nature relationship. We constantly. I was to give you an example. I was on a spring day, which is a sort of collective meeting on Terschelling every year for people that work on sustainability. I was there last year for the first time in my life. There were 800 people there who were thinking about sustainability. And the sentence I heard most is, we should utilize nature more for carbon sequestration. Now, yeah, there we are. We should use nature for carbon sequestration. That's good for us. Nature is just an instrument, then, if you get my drift. On a talk that I gave at the Schelling, I told the people there that I had been on an island a week before and was talking to an old farmer who was walking his land, and that was a land full of wildlife, but also full of beautiful rocks. And at a certain moment, he stopped and pointed at a few rocks and said, "Don't the rocks display themselves beautifully today?" Now, you have a totally different attitude. You feel what I'm trying to say? And unless we can slowly and gradually grow into human beings who feel that they are partners to life on this planet, we won't really move into a sustainable direction. So for me, that is the most urgent issue. Rethink and refeel our position on this planet.
Yes, thank you.
So basically, our questions lead into many more essential questions on life. Yeah. So
Okay.
that's very interesting to hear and to reflect on. And then I would like to move on to Esther, who prepared a question on corona and litter.
Yes, Thank you, Reineke. So Matthijs, you were quite positive about the reconnection between humans and nature, but unfortunately we also see some negative consequences, and one of it is the increase of corona litter, so face masks and disposable wipes. And of course this has a really negative impact on our oceans and its wildlife. So what do you think does this say about the current connection between humans and nature? Because you said that it's mostly positively changed, but I guess this is a result that the connection decreased.
The point here is, of course, when we speak about relationships between humans and nature and the corona crisis, etc., we need to look at who changes views and who has different feels different forms of connection with nature, etc., etc. I'm quite convinced that in our Dutch population, for instance, it's another 100% of the people who reconnect with nature during the Corona crisis. I think loads of people are just bored and just want to party or want to travel and feel that they're locked up and can't do the normal things they want to do. But there's also a group of people, and I cannot exactly say what the percentage would be, but I meet and speak to a lot of people for whom this crisis meant that they were rethinking their relationship with the world, rethinking their relationship with nature, but also rethinking their own lives. Like, what was I doing before the crisis and how will I live after the crisis? I speak to a lot of young professionals who are now very, very, very occupied with themes around sustainability in their own businesses after the crisis. Now, that's not all of the population. And there will be a big part of the population who are just throwing away their masks and throwing away their litter and are just bored and want to go to Ibiza as quickly as possible. But those are not the people that we need to lean on for change. It's the cultural creatives, as the term is used in sociology, the people who develop a new world view and start to live that new worldview. And in sociology, it has always been stated that doesn't need to be more than about 20% of society. If you have 20% of society, and particularly of vocal people and people who show their lives and show their changes in life, when you have 20% who really have an other view of the future and start to live accordingly, then the rest of society will slowly move with that. You don't need the 100%. So I put my eggs in the basket of the people who are really moved by change and are really struck by new relationships and new images. And that a big part of the population still is not there. Okay, they will follow later.
And what do you think about the role of like companies and the government? Because I think at this moment, it's really important to look for sustainable solutions.
Absolutely. No. And in certain companies, I see that happening. I'm invited. The strange thing for me in the Corona crisis was that I thought, now I don't have any work anymore because most of my work is teaching and giving classes and seminars, etc. So I have been busier than ever, be it online, but I have been having meetings with all kinds of organizations and companies, even big banks, discussing the future, post-Corona future. And I feel that there's absolutely quite an important part of the larger companies, but particularly the smaller companies, but also the larger companies, there is a serious search for a different future. I also thought that was happening in our government, but sadly enough, I don't see that everywhere yet. When you look at what happened to KLM, they got their money without any serious requests on more sustainable business models. That's in the Netherlands. By the way, in other countries, that's different. For instance, in Britain, the requests on sustainable business models for companies that get government funding is much more strict than here in the Netherlands. So in other countries, you see that the governments are also moving with the Corona crisis into a sustainable, or let's say a change into a more sustainable future. But definitely the governments have to play a role in this as well. But in the end, governments are always a reflection of the voters. And it starts with the voters. You see, I'm a very old man compared to you, and I lived through the 70s and the 80s as a young student, and that was the period in which the New Age movement and the hippies and all this kind of stuff that happened in the 60s and 70s happened. That made a major change in society. When you look at what has changed since the 60s and the 70s in terms of right, for instance, for female rights and the position of the female, gender rights, etc., that all came from that period. But the people who were hippies in the 70s, that was not 100% of the society. That was maybe 10 to 15%, but they were cultural creators and they changed things. And ultimately, the governments followed. So I believe very strongly in the power of cultural creatives. You are all part of that cultural creative community.
Yeah, so thank you. So this answer leads us to the last question. So how can we as humans all reconnect to nature?
All. I don't think that we will all reconnect, but a lot of us can reconnect. And as I said, I have the feeling that that's in part what's happening during the Corona crisis. First of all, it is important, of course, that you can come into contact with nature. When nature is just an abstract concept that you never experience, living in a concrete jungle, then you cannot connect to anything. So one of my very important issues has always been we should, in our spatial planning, allow space for nature everywhere. I use the phrase "nature into the nightclub." Basically, what we have done very much in our spatial planning is we have brought nature to nature reserves and put fences around it, and the rest around them, and the rest of the space is used for human activities, and nature is more and more eliminated from those human activities. Look at our agricultural landscape and the past city landscape, where there's very little space for nature. That is changing, particularly in urban development. I feel it's important that nature should be closer to our daily lives, and that we should have natural elements in our direct environment, from school gardens to green roofs, etc., in the city, but also more place for nature in our agricultural landscape. That's one thing, so that you can come into contact with nature. And then another thing, and that's also extremely important, I feel, is the narrative that we use when we speak about nature. Our Western narrative, which is a narrative that has its roots in classical philosophy or classical worldviews, is that nature is there for us. We see nature as a collection of objects. I feel that it is extremely important that we, cultural creatives, you, cultural creatives, formulate a different narrative of nature. A narrative of a world not full of objects that are there for us or to use, but a world full of subjects that you make contact with. And then a tree is not just an it, a tree is a thou, is an other subject. And narratives are extremely important. The way we talk about nature ultimately also determines how we experience nature. And when our narratives become different, we also start to look in a different way. So give more room for contact with nature by having nature everywhere in our surroundings, and also listen to our own narratives. And then take 5 minutes a day to look at something that is natural, without any idea, without any concept, without any label, and then you make contact automatically.
I think that's a very good advice to leave us with. Thank you.
Okay.
I think there's a lot also to think about now, after all the questions we asked, all the new questions that came up. So yeah, thanks a lot for this interview, for the podcast. And I think we heard many interesting thoughts that we can talk about further, probably for hours, but we leave it for now at this. And yeah, let's hope that the Corona has made us even more aware of the importance of nature conservation, and gave us also new perspectives on how to think about it and what questions to ask yourself. So next time you walk through nature, maybe take a different perspective and ask yourself different questions on your relationship with the natural environment. And well, we invite you to do the walk for wildlife, actually, that we did last year. And you can find the route and our experiences on our website, ffnacademy.org. And we are curious through your experiences, so you can share that again on our social media. So, and don't forget to check out our social media posts on the Walk for Wildlife virtual edition this year. And I hope to see you soon outside. Thank you all. Thanks, Matthijs, and thanks, Ruben, Monica, and Esther. And as I said, see you soon.